Good morning, everyone. I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 30 of the House of Commons Standing Committee of Indigenous and Northern Affairs. We recognize that we meet on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples. I'd like to welcome two new members of our committee. Both Lori and Will are online, and Deputy Gill is online as well. And we have quite a few people here today to present. And so I would ask that keep your earpieces in your ear, because people will switch back from English and French so that you're not getting delayed. And that way you'll be able to hear. And it's better on the interpreters. So for those people online, use the raise hand function, and the clerk will help me identify. And I wanted to thank again everyone for being here. And as individuals, we have Catherine Fournier, Ryan Beaton, lawyer, Jeanette Corbier, Lavelle, Mary Hanneberg, Don Lavelle, Harvard, Director of First People House of Learning. And then we have the Edmonton Stragglers, Stephen Bentley, Elder and Band Politics Committee member, Mark Nick Dorf, Elder and Band Politics Committee member. Welcome. And I guess we'll start with the individuals, as Catherine and Ryan, who will be speaking 5 minutes. And I'll let you know when you have about 30 seconds left, just so you can wrap up and your thoughts. But then there's going to be a lot of time and exchanges for you to get things out too as well through the answers and the questions. So go ahead. Is it Catherine or Ryan? Who's going to go?
I don't do anything. Thank you very much. And I'd like to start by telling a little bit of my family's history. My dad was Francophone, my mother Cree and Ojibwe, and her parents, my maternal grandparents, spent many years in a residential school and married after leaving the school. Mostly they lived in Indian country, but they moved to Kenora just before my mother was born. And my grandfather enfranchised in 1922 in order to vote, because I guess in Kenora that was a place that he could possibly vote if he wasn't an Indian. At that time, his family was automatically enfranchised, so my grandmother and my aunts and uncles were automatically enfranchised. My mother was born after that, so she never had status. She received status in 1985 when the Indian Act was changed then, but she received a very limited status that she could only pass to her children. Growing up, we always knew that story about the Indian Act and about enfranchisement, but we never knew, never could imagine challenging the Indian Act or challenging that idea. And enfranchisement, while it was well known by my family, was never talked about anywhere. And even as the context of what you might call Indigenous rights or the recognition of self-government, and some of those things began to come into the public discourse, enfranchisement, as far as I knew, was never talked about. And I didn't know any other families with this history. Then I heard about a case in Quebec several years ago about enfranchisement, where INAN was taken to court, and that case was won by the plaintiff. That led me to Ryan and the two families that he was working with then on enfranchisement. And so our three brave little families, with Ryan's support and leadership, decided to challenge the Indian Act and challenge the Government of Canada on the enfranchisement provisions. And that's what's led us here today. That's why we're here today. And I will let Ryan explain the ups and downs of the legal challenge and the legislative process. All I would say is that as we began this process, I was astounded by how many people contacted me hearing about this challenge to the enfranchisement provisions, and they told similar stories, and we learned more and more about how many families had a history of enfranchisement. And it proved to me even more clearly now that the goal of enfranchisement, which was not just to reward Indians of good character as it was presented to my grandfather back in 1922, not just to reward Indians of good character by letting them become citizens of Canada, but it was also to remove once and for all status Indians from the calculus of this country, which I think we would agree meets certain definitions of a genocidal approach. And we're very glad to be able to be here today and to see this work being undertaken. Thank you.
I just want to add as an initial matter, it's really important to understand that unlike the McIver and Deschanel cases, in this case the court ordered a tailored remedy that, if it goes into effect, would not hinder anyone else's ability to register, would not hinder Parliament's ability to go further in changes if it wanted to. I'll just briefly note what the court said on this point, quote, "In summary, the declarations would remedy the precise charter violations identified by the plaintiffs as conceded by Canada without restricting any entitlements or benefits under the Indian Act and without limiting Parliament's ability to craft any further legislative changes that it may consider appropriate," end quote. So I just want to stress there's no need to hold hostage the charter rights of the plaintiffs and those like them who the court has identified as having their rights violated in order for Parliament to carry on the work of Bill S2 and decide whether it wants to remove the second generation cutoff and go broader. So we would certainly urge Canada to stop fighting to stop the court order from going into effect. If that went into effect, it would deal with the charter violations already identified, and Parliament would be free to pursue its debate on Bill S2 without the pressure of a court-ordered deadline. I really think it's important for the committee to understand that point.
Next, we have Jeanette Corbière-Laval. You will have 5 minutes, up to 5 minutes.
Miigwech. Giwet nang nishnikas nishnabay kwendao. Kade kek do them no we come gong don't jaba. Good morning, everybody. My name is Jeanette Corbière-Laval, and I am the Enigan without Edwin Dogzich, which is the Citizenship Commissioner for the Anishinaabe Nation. We represent 39 First Nations across Northern Ontario, and with a combined population of 70,000 citizens, 1/3 of Ontario's First Nations population. Edwin Dogzich means those who belong. We adopted our Edwin Dogzich Nakanigewan based on the one-parent rule. I am mandated to assist our First Nations in the exercise of our inherent right to self-determination. Last year, we adopted the Declaration on Edwin Dogzich, which is the foundation of our jurisdiction and our First Nations citizenship laws. I must be clear. We know who belongs. We know our families, our people. Edwin Dogzich Nakanigewan is distinct from Indian status, which is determined by the federal government. So these two must not be mixed up. With respect to Indian status, Canada must end the sex and race discrimination now. You can do this by passing Bill S2 as amended. I live on the Wikwemikong unceded reserve, and in 1970, 2 weeks after I married a non-status man, I received a letter from Indian Affairs saying, "Jeanette Corbière, you are no longer a member of the Wikwemikong unceded reserve." Find enclosed a check for $35. That was it, $35. That's all that my rights were worth. Why should I lose my connection to my people, my sense of belonging? This is where I was born. My family, my relatives are here. My ancestors are buried. And if I had returned, I could have been charged with trespassing, hauled away by the police. That's the way it was. And so I began a lifetime of fighting sex discrimination in the Indian Act. I am the plaintiff in the 1971 case, the Attorney General versus Laval, which challenged Section 12(1)B of the Indian Act. I argued that the provision violated the Equality Clause of the 1960 Canadian Bill of Rights by discriminating on the basis of sex. The judge suggested that I should be happy because a white man married me and because I was better off. But I didn't give up. And we've seen a few victories over the years. And yet, I'm still here before you, fighting. Because young people now are facing the same stripping of our rights that I did in those early days. In my Anishinaabe Nation, we follow a one-parent rule. We know who our people are. Edwin Dogsaje, those who belong. Eliminating the second generation cutoff and following a one-parent rule and supporting our First Nations' inherent jurisdiction to decide who belongs is the way for the Government of Canada to right its wrongs. This is the only way to stop the forced assimilation that I faced when I married and that our young people are facing today. It's also really sad for me to say that this forced assimilation is still going strong. Because of Canada's laws, some of our 39 First Nations in the Anishinaabe Nation have 50% of 6-2 status Indians. And I know what this means for our collective nations. This means the Government of Canada is legally extinguishing our people. And now we hear that the government, you, want to keep consulting through the collaborative process. My Anishinaabe Nation says, eliminate the second generation cutoff. You don't need to wait for those consultations to make it right. You have consulted us quite a while now.
Jeanette, you have 30 seconds.
Okay. So all I want to say is to end and remind all of you that end the second generation cutoff and return our women, children, and grandchildren to their rightful place where they belong. And you can do that by eliminating that second generation cutoff in Bill S2.
Chi-miigwech.
Oh.
Chi-miigwech. And next we have Mary Hannenberg. You'll have 5 minutes.
Sego, Wariyunjits. My name is Mary Hannenberg. I'm a member of the Gunnesetagi Mohawk community, and I live on the territory. I am a mother, a grandmother, and an aunt. Thank you for the invitation to the People's House. Thank you very much for the invitation to the People's House. In 1996, I had gone to see Sister Mary Tuax Early, a pioneer woman who fought along all the other women and who also fought with Nellie Carson. And she passed away in the hospital on her deathbed. She told me that it was up to me to continue the fight. I'm here today. It's been a long and arduous fight. Throughout the decades, I've been involved in the fight that has brought Bill C-31, Bill C-3, and S-3, the Deschanel, along with many other women in the same fight for equality against the ongoing discrimination in the Indian Act. This is what I have seen. It's a non-priority with the government. It doesn't matter. It's not a priority. As a mental health worker in my community, I have witnessed that the second generation cutoff impacts community members on a day-to-day basis. These impacts include loss of culture, loss of language, no access to services such as psychologists, therapists covered by non-insured health benefits, no medical transportation, you cannot ride the bus, no educational funding, no access to culturally appropriate resources such as detox centers, with a growing problem of alcohol and opiates addiction, inability to own or inherit land to build a home, inability to participate in voting for your elected leadership in your community, inability to be buried in your own cemetery with your own kin. These are how it impacts on us, our lives on a daily. Exclusion and denial of services equal loss of sense of belonging, loss of hope, loss of purpose, loss of connection. The discrimination has an impact on our sense of belonging, which is a fundamental human need. You feel less than, you're not enough. It causes grave psychological, emotional, spiritual, and economic harm. Ganasatagi Mohawk Community Specific Data Sheet. You will each receive one, or you have them. As of December 31st, 2025, 36.54% in Section 6.2 are registered. This is what genocide looks like. I've seen that community members are impacted, yet they are reluctant to speak out for fear of outing themselves because discriminatory policy has been internalized. I have seen incited violence within my own community as a result of the lack of resources. It would be irresponsible to bring about these changes without the necessary addition to community funding. And I give you an example of a blanket, adding more people to the blanket, which would be the resources. And the blanket never gets bigger. This is what causes the violence and the racial and the racism. MMIW2GS Plus reported in 2019 explicitly identifies the discriminatory policies as having a direct connection with increased violence towards Indigenous women. It broadens the gap and it increases the risks. I agree with Mr. Troy Chalifoux, who presented in the previous session. The work has already been done for you. Ongoing talks of consultation when the solution has already been brought forward on many occasions and in various documents. Lengthy litigation has been taking our precious time away from our families when the government knows that this is a discriminatory policy and practice, and they are reluctant to change the guise under the guise of need for additional consultation. Knowing that no consultation was had when my mother was stripped of her rights. It was devastating for my mother. Her broken connection was stolen from her. My mother was a fluent speaker. She had ties to her community, but she could not live there. There are solutions spelled out in a document. It's called Making It Stop. And one of the documents were sent here.
30 seconds, Mary.
I would like to see the solutions that are spelled out rectified before I find myself on my deathbed. I do not want to leave this fight for the next generation to have to fight. We deserve to just be. Governments move quickly on certain bills and laws, such as the C5, without any consultation, without any long-term consultation. It suits their political agenda. No need for broader consultation then. Then there's the political will, and it moves. Please work to pass the S2 with the amendments, the Senate amendments. We've waited far too long.
Thank you very much.
Nyawagoas, Gana, peace.
Thank you very much. Now we have Dawn Lavelle, Harvard, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chmiigwech. Dawn Lavelle, Harvard, Dijnakas, Wikwim Kong Donjaba. I'm the director of the First Peoples House of Learning and former president of the Native Women's Association of Canada. And as director, I'm responsible for the academic success, health, and well-being for hundreds of our First Nations youth each year. And I'm here to share what I've learned after spending countless nights in the emergency unit with yet another First Nations youth who has tried to end their life. Because we know that culture saves lives. Having a strong identity and a strong sense of community saves lives. Knowing who you are and where you belong gives our young people the strength to continue on living. And if we care about the lives of our First Nations youth, and I truly believe that everyone in this room does, I'm here to tell you that with respect to Indian status, Canada must end the sex and race discrimination now. You must pass Bill S2 exactly as amended by the Senate as quickly as you can, end the second generation before more lives are lost. Because in 1985, when the 6.2 category was created, the government created a legal situation that is still causing irreparable harm to our young people. Because we know, as Mary said, that having a sense of belonging is vital for our mental health, and yet every day we see First Nations youth who are in crisis, who feel like they don't belong in their First Nation, like they don't have a right to be there. Because back in 1985, in fact, Canada passed legislation to ensure that they don't have a right to be there, that they don't have a right to belong, and they don't have the same rights as their cousins. 14,000 children just since 2019, according to ISK's own numbers. That's 14,000 children that have grown up without rights, without the rights to language and culture programs, without the right to even play on the hockey team in their community. They're sitting on the sidelines and watching their cousins and siblings. Our youth are being told right to their faces that because they are 6'2" or they are non-status, they don't belong in our First Nations, they don't belong at our ceremonies or our fires, and our youth are being attacked on social media because they're being told that they're taking up resources that should be for the real Indians. And we wonder why we have a mental health crisis. Suicide rates among our youth are 6 times higher than non-Indigenous youth, and that's according to the government's own statistics. Suicide and self-inflicted injuries are the leading cause of death for First Nations youth and adults up to 44 years old. Canada must correct what was made wrong in 1985. We are not talking about going back hundreds of years to some distant ancestor. We are talking about the children of our current 6'2" band members. We are talking about babies, children, and youth. And Canada needs to make this right so we can tell all of our children that they belong. Our teachings tell us every life is precious, and everyone says all lives matter. And even one life lost to suicide is too much. At my mother's side, I have spent over 52 years fighting against this discrimination, and I am still here fighting because our children deserve better. Why, after 55 years, are we still continuing study after study, delay after delay, instead of eliminating the root cause? Because we have an opportunity to make a change. We know this is causing harm, and if we're not acting to stop the harm, then we are in fact complicit. In some of our First Nations, up to 50% have 6'2" status, and we know that means that individual rights holders like my children and my nieces, who are working hard to achieve their dreams, are the end of their line. And our people who have been on this land for over 60,000 years, and yes, we have the archaeological research to prove that, they are going to be the end of that line. And we also know for our collective nations, this means the legal extinguishment of our people. So unless this was the intention and still continues to be the intention, this must stop. We've been part of the collaborative process. You've heard from our elders and youth, and I really believe we must act now before we lose even one more youth. We don't have time for more studies. We can debate numbers. We can talk about costs. We can talk about the 320,000 people over the next 40 years, which works out to about 12 per band per year. Or we can pass Bill S2 as amended and end the second generation cutoff and tell our young people they belong and end this legislated extinction policy. Thank you. 10 years ago, exactly 10 years ago, May 2016, I stood at the United Nations behind Carolyn Bennett when the Liberal government said that they signed on to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights for Indigenous People. I was standing behind her because our tradition is you physically get up and you stand behind the people you believe in. You stand behind them to show them support. So I was the first one to stand up behind her when she said that this government signs on to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And ending the second generation cutoff does not violate the UN Declaration. It is not telling our First Nations who their people are. It's in fact removing a barrier that prevents us from accepting who we know our people are. Because we must remember that Indian status is distinctly separate from band membership. There's processes for bands to develop their own membership, so this is not in any way infringing on the United Nations Declaration or the rights of our bands, our inherent rights. This is about lives. This is not about numbers. And every day on social media, I see people fundraising for millions for some treatment. And if we would pay millions for one person, hundreds of thousands for their cancer treatment, how much does one life in our community, one of our children, how much would we pay? So let's stop debating how much it's going to cost.
Thank you, Don.
Chimiigwech.
Now, next, we have Steve Bentley, Elder, from the Edmonton Stragglers.
Good day. My name is Stephen Bentley. I represent the Edmonton Stragglers, a historically removed band that was made up primarily of women and represents one of the earliest legislative removals using gender. We have a story that's rooted in S3 legislation and has harbingers for S2. We appear before you today to speak to the origins and continuity in the present-day legal reality of the Edmonton Stragglers, an Indigenous collective whose existence has been documented, administered, and yet paradoxically denied. The Register is registering our people per Section 11 band membership regulations from our band list of the Edmonton Stragglers, but the registration is fraught with difficulties both in obtaining the requisite information and privacy concerns of the department, creating a bottleneck impeding timely and complete registrations. We ask the Minister Alty, who has the discretion under her power of May, to direct the Department ISC, Indigenous Services Canada, to engage with us to overcome these issues and move on to empower the rights of our ancestors, women, and to fully allow their descendants the ability to form a chief and council and thus to fully engage with the Crown. We ask further that a dedicated registration expediter should be appointed to address the ongoing delays and systemic inefficiencies in the Indian status registration process, a model similar to the expedited passport processing 90 days or it's free agenda. It would introduce accountability and timeliness into a process that currently leaves applicants waiting years. Justice in this case is justice denied. We also submit that a second-generation cutoff should not be rigidly applied to those being now registered under S3. A more equitable approach would be to allow a third-generation registration for our members whose exclusion was rooted in historic discrimination. This is not expansion, it's restoration, which is unique to our case and thus differentiates from other instances of corrective measures of other peoples who were never on pay lists, whilst our people span over 100 years of enrollment, demonstrated treaty community connections dating back to the True Roe Wampum and the Selkirk Treaty of 1817 before reclassification by Canada, which allowed for processing under inferior legislation protected by the 4th clause of the 1850 Indian Act and other legislation. The Edmonton Stragglers were not a transient or incidental grouping. We were a recognized band explicitly identified in the public record as a band of Indians owning land in the Edmonton vicinity. Our members were enumerated, tracked, and governed through the colonial administrative systems, including Hudson's Bay Company records, ecclesiastical records, and early census instruments tied to the Imperial Crown obligations. Yet, despite this clear documentary foundation, the Crown later advanced a legal fiction that scrip extinguished our collective identity and rights. Scrip in practice did not function as a lawful extinguishment mechanism. It was inconsistently applied, often coercive, and critically it targeted individuals, not the collective identity of a band. The notion that it erased the people is unsupported in law and fact. Today, under the amendments of Bill S3, we are witnessing a quiet but profound contradiction. The Federal Registrar is actively reconstructing the very band list that Canada once treated as extinguished. Individuals are being registered precisely because their ancestors were last recognized on the Edmonton Stragglers list. This is not a revival, it's a confirmation of the continuity of our community. And that continuity carries legal consequences. Under Section 11 of the Indian Act, control over band membership flows from recognized band lists. What now exists is a growing population of entitled people, our families whose lineages traces directly to this list, yet without the corresponding recognition of the band entity itself. This creates a structural inconsistency, a band list without a band. The historic reason for this fragmentation is clear: sex-based discrimination embedded in the Indian Act. Our women lost status upon marriage, our children were excluded, and entire families' lines were administratively severed. The result was not extinction, but dispersal.
30 seconds,
and I will
please.
turn this over to my colleague.
You have 30 seconds to contribute, but we have quite a bit of time in question and answers period too.
Dancy Asnia Wasis. My name in Cree is Stonechild. To carry on where my colleague left off, we are now engaged in correcting that injustice. but the process is slow, burdensome, and incomplete. Many of our families remain one step away from registration or reoccurring administration completion. Excuse me. However, the passage of Bill S2 would expand entitlement further, compounding an already strained system. Finally, the legal continuity of our claim is not speculative, but is grounded in clear legislation and constitutional lineage. The Royal Proclamation of 1763, 1847, Provincial Census Framework, 1850 to 1857, Indian legislation defining Indigenous belongings.
Mark, we're going to have to move on to questions because I think everyone wants to ask you guys questions because the time is up for the presentation time. But please submit your stuff that you have in writing too as well. But people will be able to ask you questions and you'll be able to pull it out, okay? Because we're just over the time and we want to have the exchange of between you and our members, please. So thank you.
Okay.
Okay, so first up is the Conservatives, and you will have 6 minutes for questions and answers. And Billy, I believe you're first.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to our guests for coming today. I want to start with Ms. Lavelle Harvard. You mentioned you were at the UN and you were standing behind former Minister Carolyn Bennett, Liberal Minister Carolyn Bennett, and she was endorsing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. I've often found that, I've been a first-time MP for the last year. The government's very good at making announcements, but not necessarily good at follow-through and actual substance to real reconciliation. What does it say about the government when they can make those announcements, you can stand behind them, but they've made no indication that they'll get rid of the second-generation cutoff?
Exactly. And this is exactly the thing. It needs to be more than just a performative moment standing in New York. And Carolyn Bennett literally got a standing ovation. I was the first person to stand up behind her, and the entire room stood up, and the entire world was watching. And the entire world is still watching to see if the government is willing to actually walk the talk and make the changes. And that's why that United Nations Declaration is so important, because, in fact, it says that we have the right to determine who our own people are, our own members. And this barrier, the second-generation cutoff, is preventing us from exercising that right. And if the government of Canada, and I truly believe that they can, continue and honor and walk the talk and be more than performative and actually make a change. And this is the moment right now to show that it was more than just a performative action, and that it's more than just Conservatives versus Liberals versus that this is about Canada and what Canada stands up for and what Canada stands up for on an international stage and how the world sees what Canada stands for.
Thank you. I want to go to Ms. Hanneberg. And you were talking a lot about real-life, tangible things in communities, and I've heard these testimonies over the last 6 months. I lived it myself on my own First Nation of, one kid gets to go be on the hockey team. Another kid doesn't get to be on the hockey team. One kid gets to go to school on the bus. The other kid, who's their first cousin or even their sister or brother in some cases, doesn't get to go on the bus. And it's really good that you were talking about real-life situations. We've heard those testimonies. And can you elaborate a little bit more on those? And the government has committed to doing Jordan's Principle. They've made some announcements in that regard. But I'm reading even the Jordan's Principle qualifications, and it says, are registered or eligible to be registered under the Indian Act. Has one parent or guardian who is registered under the Indian Act is recognized by their nations for the purposes of Jordan's Principle, or is a resident on reserve. Can you see that the second generation cutoff also inhibits kids from getting the rightful supports that they need?
Certain fundings are specific, and certain services are wanting to have the band number. That Indigenous service number clears the way, and it does clear the way for our community, because council and leadership understand per capita, and the per capita opens that door. And we have people that are waiting for a long time to see a psychologist because the psychologist only wants the band number. And you cannot even go in as a family under one band number. They want the band number for that particular person. So if you have a child that needs a special therapist, and we have the therapists in the community, too bad, they will not be seen. We are excluded. There are exclusion. In my own family, my son has a daughter. My granddaughter is registered because he was born in 1974, and he has a child. She's registered. But my daughter, who was born in 1989, too bad. It's too cutoff date. How does that make sense? That one from the same parent, from the same community, living in community, trying to participate, and there are others. There's not only mine, but I get up and I speak, irregardless of how I'm going to be treated. And I've had racism. I've had violence in my community. We've had people show up and beat up my nephews because we had taken a home. We needed a place to live. This is what goes on in our daily life, and this has to stop. This is insane. This is perpetuated by the Indian Act, and that second-generation cutoff rate now is the barrier. We've gone through all the other barriers, but this has taken years, litigation and court proceedings.
I just want to build on, sorry to cut you off. I got one more minute here. Do you also feel like reconciliation of the government has become too performative? You mentioned politics earlier. We've heard that there seems to be using consultation as a shield, but they don't consult on other bills. And so there's like a double standard here. Do you feel like reconciliation of the government has become performative?
I've seen it on many, many years. I've been through so many ministers you would not believe. Every minister that has represented Indigenous affairs, whether it be Mark Miller, Minister Gary Andesangari, Patty Haidu, all of them. You go and you talk and, oh, we're working on it. We're working on it. Performative and words. Without the action, without the concrete action and results, we have not seen. And then in the end, they start avoiding us. They start avoiding us because they know we're going to be continuing. Every day I send a letter to this Parliament. Every day to House of Commons. All the Liberals and all the other people have received a letter. All have received a letter requiring the S2 be worked on. I brought one here today for the INAN committee. I've sent one in the past.
Thank you, Mary Ann.
I will continue.
Thank you, Mary Ann. We do have that letter, and I truly appreciate that.
Thank you very much.
Next, we have Lori for 6 minutes online.
First of all, thank you to all the witnesses for sharing your experiences and the importance of making sure that we address discrimination in the Indian Act. And I've heard clearly that there continues to be discrimination, and it's so wonderful to at least virtually meet Catherine. And my question initially to you is about the Senate amendments and the consultation that might be required. We've heard, for example, from the Edmonton's regulars, one set of recommendations to make a fix. We've heard that, for example, the Senate amendments include a solution as well. So we have different solutions that have different potential impacts for different First Nations. And I wonder if you could share with us why it would be important to learn what the most appropriate solution will be to avoid a situation that put you in the situation where you sought legal action. Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you very much for that question. And I would like to let Ryan, as well as our legal counsel, respond to some of the points that you're raising, Ms. Idlut. But one thing that I will say from my own family's experience, my mother, who was the daughter of two status Indians in their own right, and who endured residential school, because the reason that she didn't have status was because of enfranchisement as opposed to marrying out kinds of reasons, she was given an extremely limited, she was provided the most limited 6-2 status in 1985 when she applied for status. That only allowed her to pass that to her children. And in the case of the three families, and then all the other people that we've heard from since, we realize that the issue, at least for us, is that enfranchisement caused a whole different series of procedures and policies to come into play for those families that have the experience of enfranchisement. So in my view, there are differences between that and the second generation cutoff kinds of issues. And certainly, I think that we have heard clearly enough on enfranchisement to know that a remedy is required for that. In fact, at the time that the original Bill C-38 was introduced, a minister at the time, Patty Hadju, said, it will be as though the enfranchisement never occurred. And so that's what we have been looking forward to and aiming at and working towards for these last number of years. And I can let Ryan speak a little bit more to the actual issues involved. My understanding is that in the Bill S2, provisions were included in there to address other outstanding issues within the Indian Act, although the work began with our three little families on enfranchisement as being an important enough issue and a strong enough issue and a complex enough issue on its own. And I'm not able to say whether the inclusion of other issues in Bill S2, that's for others and those around this table to decide. But I will say that enfranchisement was identified by Canada and by the ministers of the INAC, I still call it INAC, at the time as being a wrong that required resolution, that required to be righted. And that's really why we're here. And perhaps Ryan can speak a bit more to some of the questions that you have, specific questions you've raised, Mr. Lute.
Ryan, you have a minute, just over a minute, please.
I'll just say that the plaintiffs and Nicholas collectively have asked me to tell the committee they support the Senate amendments. They support removal of second-generation cutoff. They know what it is to be separated from their communities. And they don't want second-generation cutoff to remain in the Act in their name with the excuse that there needs to be a narrower fix for the Nicholas case. So as I've stressed, the court order in Nicholas is a tailored remedy. If it goes into effect, it does not hinder anyone else from registering. It does not take entitlements away from anyone. That's different than was the situation in McIver and Deschenaux. And so there's no reason, we say, for Canada to keep fighting to prevent the court order from going into effect in order to allow Parliament to continue debate on Bill S2. And Canada has said in court that there's an issue of, well, this would apply in BC, the court order, and not outside. There's a very easy solution, an order on consent from the federal court. It's been done in previous cases where Canada has accepted that the law is unconstitutional, as it did here. So there's a very easy fix so that the charter violations that have been identified can end while Parliament can continue its debate on Bill S2.
Thank you, and that's the time we had there. Next, we go to Deputy Gill. 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci. Thank you, Chair. Thank you also to all our witnesses with us today. As I listened carefully to all your remarks. On many occasions, you talked about genocide, you talked about discrimination, and my impression is that while certain political parties might be hesitating in terms of passing S2, it has to do with the Senate amendments which including removing the second-generation cutoff. And when we talk about genocide, we talk about a loss of language, identity, of course, of culture as well. And this really goes to the heart of identity that is being lost. That's what we're talking about when we talk about genocide. Why do you think the government wants to continue to postpone the passing of this bill? Because we're talking about genocide, we're talking about discrimination. So my question, I wonder, is this the question that the government wants to ask the different communities? Because I don't think anyone anyone will say that they agree with discrimination or with genocide. So what would the government's motives be to further consult First Nations? And do you think that instead we should go ahead with passing Bill S2? Whoever would like to answer this question, and please tell us whether you agree or not with a further consultation. Thank you.
The question is basically if, I see the government as utilizing, and this is another thing I didn't get a chance to say, we're tired of being held hostages. We feel like we're being held hostages. My family feels like we're being held hostage because we're being negotiated, and this is an agenda, maybe to further. They were mixing membership, band membership, self-government and decision, self-determination. We're not talking about that. That is for a bigger debate and a bigger, discussion with all other nations and other leadership. We're talking about discrimination in the Indian Act and our ability to pass our lineage on to our children and our grandchildren. And this is not being respected. We are the only race that the government dictates who we are as a people. This is unacceptable. I have my daughter and my granddaughter, my grandchild. And, to me, it's like the government's telling me that child cannot be when he is carrying the ancestral blood and we're living in the community. They want to learn the language. They want to be part of the community, but we're not being allowed to because of the status number. It has to do with the S2. And it's cultural. Yes, it is cultural. Everything about living in community is. We live in a holistic way, in an inclusionary way. But when that is blocking and the funds are not there, so, you're not included. And people start internalizing this racism, and it's said to them, oh, you're not Native. And cousins are telling cousins. We've heard this before. This is not the new dialogue. Everybody's been talking about this, where the child gets pulled off the ice because he doesn't have a band number you no longer recognize. This has to stop, and it's being perpetuated by the government and the policy within the government. So to me, it's not about having, the bands can determine their membership. There are membership codes that they can adopt. Some communities have, okay? They're worried about and concerned about who are going to be their members, do their membership code. But do not put us in all of this whole thing about self-determination, and they're muddling everything all together, and we're on the sidelines standing still waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting for 40, 50 years to have our equality. We are the only race that is treated like this. This is unacceptable.
Ça veut dire, Madame Hannaberg, si je voulais pas vous...
I didn't want to interrupt you during your remarks, so I think that means that we should be ready to pass Bill S2 with the Senate amendments. We're ready. We don't need to consult.
Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to ask the same question to our other witnesses here with us today. I am for passing the bill.
So we have 1 minute. If we want to split that in half, it's going to be 30 seconds for some comments between Catherine and Dawn have their hand up.
Thank you. I just wanted to note that, these federal changes, the duty to consult is a constitutional obligation that arises when the Crown considers conduct that might adversely affect potential or established Aboriginal or treaty rights under Section 35 of the Constitution. This change will, in fact, enhance equality, and this is rectifying past injustices. This is not an adverse effect. This is going to enhance quality of life. This is going to enhance the perpetuation of our people. And unless somebody wants to suggest that we're not in support of perpetuating the life of Indigenous peoples, there's no reason to continue consulting.
Catherine, you wanted to provide 30 seconds.
Oui, merci beaucoup. Et puis,
Yes, thanks. And I'd also just like to add to what has been said, the fact that when we talk about consultation, it's true that we can really get lost in the details, tiny details and it becomes an endless process of consultation. So that's what I have to say to the question. If consultations take place in an overall way with the basic principles that we've just heard, that could be possible as consultations, but consultations that just go so much into detail that it's unavoidable that we'll arrive at a point where certain groups or certain individuals in certain communities will say yes to this, no to that, and others will say the contrary, and it just gets bogged down. And I think we finished with that type of consultation.
Very much, and we're still doing questions and answers, and MP Schmale next. 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you again to our witnesses on this very important topic. Maybe I'll start with Ms. Hanneberg, just because you were one of the last ones speaking. Given the fact that the dynamics in Parliament have changed between a minority Parliament to a majority, are you getting a warm and fuzzy feeling from the government that they're going to move forward with these amendments?
I just want to say that basically there's mixed messages there and very fuzzy. Yes, very fuzzy. They don't seem to be wanting to move, and the things that are going on with the changes, the potential, speaking of changing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, you know, it suits certain agendas and policies like I talked to before. You know, when things suit them, they will move fast on it. But adding more people and allowing our communities to flourish is not a priority. And even though there's talk about reconciliation and, you know, wanting healthy communities and determinants of health that they sign on with Health Canada, it's not coming through to be, you know, genuine. So right now, I'm really very concerned about that because we need to see some action. And the words that were given, such as when Don was talking about, you know, the UNDRIP, I mean, being at the United Nations, standing behind, this, the lip service has to stop. And we need to see some action now. We're losing our people. We're losing, this is genocide policy. This is genocide. We're moving towards genocide. And you don't know how many years. Right now, some of the communities are at their last generation of being able to transmit status. We have to move on this, and we have an equal responsibility to keep those communities healthy. And this is why we're here today, to speak about the injustices that are going on and the barriers, the obstacles that have been put in front of us. We have to have those barriers and obstacles removed.
There are a few things I do want to dive into in your opening remarks that kind of tweaked my interest here, but I did notice when I asked that question, your seatmate here, Ms. Lavelle-Harvard, did react to my first question. Maybe I could get a comment from you, and I also have a question about enfranchisement as well. So I have a limited amount of time, but a lot of questions here.
So I really wanted to jump in because, again, I have a history with this particular government. I was one of the national leaders that stood with the Prime Minister at sunrise. We were all stumbling around at 4 o'clock in the morning in the dark Parliament Hill, that first sunrise ceremony, where the Liberal government committed and said, you know, in our first national leaders meeting with all the national leaders, that there is no relationship more important to this government than that of its Indigenous peoples, First Nations peoples. And if this does not go through, if we continue to delay and use consultation as a stalling tactic, then that comment will be proven to be false. So we really need to see that this government uphold its commitment to our people in front of our elders and our youth and all of our national leaders, our commitment on those territories and that land, that they committed that this relationship was important. And this is the most important part of that relationship, is whether we continue to exist.
Okay, I have about 90 seconds left, and I have about 2 or 3 questions. So maybe I'll quickly go to you, Ms. Hanneberg, but I really want to get to Ms. Fournier as well. You mentioned in your opening remarks about the cost, right? And we've heard, you know, the department say cost, and there's the monetary, there's the humanitarian as well. I think most of what we're talking about isn't, when you have this gigantic budget with ISC, it's really minimal when you look at it. And I don't want to take up too much time. Maybe in 30 seconds or less, can you just explain about the cost that you were, I think it's more the humanitarian as well, that you were mentioning.
Well, basically, it would be the cost that goes to communities when they're, putting out a budget to make sure that it will match the needs of the people, the newly registrants. Because there is costs and there are programs. And, Indigenous Services needs to tally the costs per person, per capita, and increase it so that there is not this racism and hatred because, oh, you're taking away and you're pulling at my little end of the blanket. We've seen this before. This has created violence. We've had witnessed violence because of that. You're coming here and you're taking our resources.
I think that's all the time we're going to have. But if you want to submit that in writing, actually, because I think it's a good question, so that all of you could submit that into writing so we could have it. But we have to go to our next questioner, and that is Deputy Levac. 5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to all our witnesses here today. We really are grateful for your testimony, your attendance here. I'd just like to start by saying that we all agree that the Indian Act is discriminatory, has caused extreme forms of harm. We're here, we want to redress these injustices, we want to rectify the law. I don't agree with my colleagues that this government is just performative when it comes to reconciliation. I think we're taking concrete measures as a government, and the minister herself has publicly committed to deal with the second generation cutoff. We will do it, but how will we do it? We've made a clear commitment, and we've done this on many occasions in the past year. We will adopt this bill. We will rectify the injustices in the Indian Act. When we drafted Bill S2, it was to deal with the question of enfranchisement. Could we heard Madame Fournier a bit more on this? What's the concrete impact of enfranchisement on you, on those close to you? What have been the concrete effects of enfranchisement? Thank you very much for the question. I can say that I don't use the word enfranchisement when I talk in French, émancipation. I like to use the English word enfranchisement because émancipation recalls slavery, for example, and when you talk about the emancipation of slaves, there are some things that are comparable, but I don't like that word in French. My mother talked to me about enfranchisement and the effects it had on her when she was younger. She knew who she was. She knew she was the daughter of these two people who came from their communities, who left their communities to spend many years in a residential school. But we heard from the other witnesses as well that this idea of being displaced, of the feeling of no longer belonging to their community, and that was huge for her in her life. And the other two families who are part of the legal challenge that Ryan discussed, in one of these families, there was an enfranchisement policy to ensure that the children would not have to go to residential school because at a certain point in time, it was mandatory for Indian children to go to residential schools. So there was the same break, the same lack of connection, the lack of this feeling of belonging, that we belong to the community. It's exactly what we heard from the other witnesses. Moreover, the ability to say, and for my children, because I have my status, because of the 85 cutoff rule, but my children did not, even though their grandmother was an Indigenous person. And for them as well, the fact that they want to be able to say that we belong to this community, we are members, we belong to the community. We can display this publicly, we can talk about our heritage openly and with great pride. I just have a minute left. I had a second question. In your opinion, does Bill S2 require other amendments when we talk about dealing directly and appropriately with everything connected to enfranchisement, or are the sections about enfranchisement sufficient as they stand? The two versions of the bill do respond to our legal challenge, and so would rectify the specific problems. The plaintiffs asked me to tell the community that it shouldn't be in their name that bill, the narrower version of S2, should be passed. There's no reason why the Parliament should limit themselves to this more tailored, narrow remedy. Parliament can, of course, debate and pass broader redress, broader remedies. Thank you very much.
Goes to Deputy Gill for 2.5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. En fait,
Thank you, Chair. Two witnesses were not able to answer my question. Just to summarize my question, are we ready or not to pass without further consultation with the, of course, the amendments put forward by the Senate, Madame Lavelle and Madame Lavelle Harvard, and Mr. from the community. I'm sorry, I've forgotten your name. Apologies for that. But I think you would also like to answer the question. So please, those two witnesses, I'd like to hear from you as well.
Stephen, or
for the opportunity to speak to that. The issues have affected our community in several and very stringent ways. The community was one community, and it was severed at the time of treaty, where we were cookie-cuttered into several distinct bands, and there was a remnant left that were processed under law and were removed from the communities and therefore had to try to exist. And over time, we impacted into the registered communities because we were still family related and married in or married out of those communities. And so I have issues where I have nephews that are actually born on or into a treaty community, and they experience the same sort of, I guess you would call it rejection, because they don't have that same status. Even though they do have S2 status, it's not enough for them to be fully appreciated by the community as a full member. There are other things that have happened too that dispersed our people quite a bit, so it's been harder for us to keep our community history together. But whenever we come together at any event, our history, it blooms and it comes back, and it shows that we still have a vibrant, very strong connection that has been impacted by the enfranchisement rules. These were very historic. But what they did was they impacted a historic Indian community that was extant when Canada showed up, and they chose to have different rules than the Imperial Crown, and in this way we were treated in a separate and a different way and processed differently than, say, peoples out in Ontario or Quebec were. And so there is differences in that way as well. And it impacted our people in many ways too, because we have this strong loss of sense of identity, and even though we were present in the diaspora, we were always recognized as being Indian, but we were never had no connection to be able to express that, and it was very frustrating because in many ways we experienced the racism from both sides over the time, and it's been difficult to sort of comprehend. But with the passing of Bill S2, I think that type of restoration would be complete.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you very much, and that's all the time we have. And thank you ever so much for your testimony and sharing your stories. Very important. Chimewich. We're going to suspend and go to our next panel. We're going to start with the testimony online from the Council of Yukon First Nations. We have Grand Chief Matiya, and I hope I said your name right. You will have 5 minutes to present, and I'll give you like a 30-second warning to wrap it up, okay? Thank you. Proceed.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for the invitation to speak. I'm zooming in from the traditional territory of Kwanlundan and Ta'an Kwachon Council here in Whitehorse, Yukon. My name is Medhia Alatini. I serve as the Grand Chief of the Council of Yukon First Nations and also the AFN Yukon Regional Chief. I'm a citizen and former chief of Kluane First Nation, a self-governing modern treaty holder nation here in Southwest Yukon. I'm speaking today as a representative of Yukon First Nations, that is 11 modern treaty holders and 3 nations still under the Indian Act. All of those nations carry both the promise and the burden of Canada's laws. I want to begin by thanking the senators for truly listening to First Nations testimony and understanding that testimony, and for also having the wisdom, and as my mom says, the gumption to amend Bill S2 to end the second generation cutoff. And I want to state clearly that we support the swift passage of Bill S2 exactly as amended by the Senate. I speak to you today as a 6'2" status Indian whose family has survived some generations of Indian Act discrimination. My 96-year-old, actually 97-year-old, as of April 1st, grandmother lost her status after having children with a non-status First Nation man or an enfranchised First Nation man. My mother was enfranchised, not because she was any less Dene or Kluane, but because of an arbitrary Indian Act clause. The Indian Act turned a family matter into a tool of assimilation. My mother was later reinstated under Bill C-31 as a 6'1", and I am now a 6'2". My children's other parent does not have status, so my line ends with me. This is not reconciliation. This is legislated extinction. The system divides our families into haves and have-nots, barring kids from programs and services, turning identity into paperwork. In the Yukon, we see this every day in health, education, and sport, where non-status First Nation kids are excluded from activities with their status cousins. They're turned away from tournaments that build connection and pride. In civic life, non-status family members cannot vote or lead in some of their home nations. This erodes identity and community belonging. In public health and safety, in the time of opioid poisonings and violence, anything that disconnects our youth from people within our communities deepens their risk. Reconciliation is a verb, and it requires action once the truth is known. And the truth is that second generation cutoff is a discriminatory extinction policy. This has been known since 1982, before it was even implemented in 1985. If this government truly cares about reconciliation and not merely litigation management, then they must address all the known discrimination law now, not later. Later is not neutral. Every day you wait, more children are cut off. Bill S2 must move through the committee urgently, making reconciliation real for the kids impacted by this before the House rises for the summer. Don't make these kids wait another 40 years. Now is the time for action, not weaponizing consultation, not conflating Indian status and band membership or citizenship to confuse people. And it's certainly not time to conveniently misinterpret the UN Declaration to delay justice. I want to make clear how much support from First Nations there is for this change. In December, I witnessed chiefs from across Canada work together to draft a strong collaborative resolution in support of passing Bill C2 or S2 as amended. to end the second generation cutoff without delay and to support a federal framework for implementation after it passes.
30 seconds, Chief. Thank you.
Thank you. This resolution was adopted unanimously at the AFN Special Chiefs Assembly. With widespread support, this path is clear. Bill S2, as amended by the Senate, to ensure Canada's compliance with international law and our Constitution, which apply equally to male and female persons. Those who are pushed out must be able to pass on status on equal terms. The second generation cutoff discriminates on the basis of race and sex and must be ended to uphold Section 15 of the Charter.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next, the Feminist Alliance for International Action. We have Sheila Day, Chair. You have 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much for this invitation and for allowing me to present this to you this morning. The Feminist Alliance is a member of the Indian Act Sex Discrimination Working Group and calls on this committee and on the Government of Canada to support Bill S2 as amended by the Senate and to pass it into law without further delay. Today, I want to talk to you about forced assimilation. Since its introduction, the goal of the Indian Act has been to erase First Nations people and absorb them into the non-Indigenous population. Settler governments have used many different strategies to control and erase First Nations peoples in order to acquire their lands and resources. Killing, scalping, starvation, residential schools, forced sterilization, and sex discrimination in the status registration provisions of the Indian Act. The devastating role that sex discrimination in the Indian Act has played in diminishing the size and strength of First Nations communities is too often overlooked. By denying First Nations women and their descendants Indian status, Canada has forced them into the non-Indigenous population, reducing the pool of Indians to whom Canada owes a fiduciary duty. This has hurt the women, their descendants, and their nations. Let us be clear. Status is a legal invention of the Government of Canada. It defines which individuals the government recognizes as holders of Indigenous rights and title, who is entitled to benefits and access to programs and services designed for First Nations. Canada confers status. When Canada takes it away, it is a profound punishment. Because the effects of pre-1985 sex discrimination are now entangled with the second generation cutoff, the 1985 cutoff, and the two-parent rule, women and their descendants remain at a disadvantage with respect to status and transmission of status even in 2026, 150 years later. But in 1985, when Canada began, ever so slowly, to discard bits of the sex discrimination, Canada did not stop its program of forced assimilation, but broadened it. Canada introduced half status, or 6-2 status, for the first time, and barred transmission of status to those with a parent and a grandparent who married out, ensuring that it could continue to reduce the pool of Indians. The Indian Act Sex Discrimination Working Group is grateful to Indigenous Services Canada for publishing the data on percentages of 6-2 status holders in every band in the country, as this permits everyone to see that the extinction of status Indians is the inevitable result of the second generation cutoff, as is the elimination of bands and reserves. There is no question the second generation cutoff violates Article 8 of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. That article guarantees Indigenous people the right not to be forcibly assimilated. Canada officially endorsed the declaration, as Don has said this morning, and passed legislation in June 2021 that commits Canada to ensuring that domestic laws mirror the rights set out in the declaration. If this commitment is real, Canada must get rid of the second generation cutoff now. In addition to extinguishing First Nations in the near future, the second generation cutoff harms First Nations individuals and families right now. First Nations women know too well the harms caused by decades of exclusion, which fracture identity and break people and communities in social and psychological ways. The second generation cutoff is now visiting these same harms on young First Nations women and men. Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau famously said in
30 seconds, Sheila, please.
Okay. Pierre Trudeau famously said in 1967 that the state has no place in the bedrooms of the nation, but the state has been in the bedrooms of First Nations since 1876 and is still there. Prime Minister Mark Carney recently said that it was a core Canadian value for the freedom of a core Canadian value was the freedom for individuals to embrace their identity and love whom they choose. He was speaking about the characters in Heated Rivalry. Unfortunately, that value that he expressed seems to apply to gay men, but not to First Nations.
We're over time
I'm
now.
encouraging you to pass this immediately.
Thank you, Sheila. Next, we have Law Office of Mary Eberts, and we have Mary here online. So go ahead, Mary, you have 5 minutes. You're on mute, Mary. You're on mute. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I speak today in support of the amendments made by the Senate to Bill S2 and urge their swift passage by the House of Commons. I am a constitutional lawyer. I taught at the Faculty of Law at the University of Toronto and have held chairs at the law schools of the University of Ottawa and the University of Saskatchewan. I have for many years also practiced constitutional and charter law and appeared as counsel in the McIver, Deschanel, and Gale cases, and that is the perspective I bring to you today. This hearing is the latest stage in a long struggle, almost 70 years, for justice for women who lost status and their children. I honor one of your other witnesses today, Jeanette Corbière-Laval, who is one of the plaintiffs in a case heard by the Supreme Court in 1974 attacking the marrying out rules. The Supreme Court ruled against Jeanette Laval and her co-plaintiff Irene Bedard, holding that the marrying out provision did not violate equality before the law, but might well violate equality under the law. And so nationwide efforts were made successfully to have a guarantee of equality under the law included in Section 15 to make a strong guarantee. The case of Andrews versus Law Society of British Columbia was the first one decided on Section 15 in 1989. And Justice McIntyre said in that case, recognizing the contribution of Indigenous women to the development of Section 15, that the worst oppression will result from discriminatory measures having the force of law. It is against this evil that Section 15 provides guarantees. That is a Supreme Court judge describing what is going on under the Indian Act now. The marrying out rule did not appear in Bill C-31. Section 61C restored status to women who lost it upon marriage. But that did not end the matter. As of 1985, the couple headed by a male who had given status to his wife and the couple where the wife regained status lost upon marriage were not on an equal footing, nor were their children. Challenges to these inequalities in the McIver and Deschanel cases did produce legislative changes, but did not put the maternal and paternal lines of descent on an equal footing. What kept the descendants of the maternal line in a subordinate position, and which still does, is the 1985 cutoff. They had to have been born before April 17th, 1985, or of a marriage contracted before that date, in order to take advantage of the equality conferred by the amendments to Section 6. These provisions assign and confine the people years and years after 1985 to the pre-1985 1985 era when women were denied equality with men. Descendants of such women are told now you can only have rights under the Charter if you are in the same position as Jacob Grismer was in 1985, all these years ago. This committee is at a crucial moment. It can accept the Senate amendments and recommend that Parliament end the discrimination now, or it can insist on keeping the present provisions in effect still longer, continuing to threaten the very existence of many First Nations. What will keep them in effect? Consultations will keep them in effect. And also, if people despair of this process and bring litigation, the provisions will remain in effect as long as the litigation takes. I urge Parliament to act now instead of abdicating its legislative power in favor of the judiciary. We know now that the 2017 version of the two-parent rule, second generation cutoff and 1985 cutoff, violates the Charter, just as its predecessors were found to do. We do not need more litigation to establish that. In the years before this legislation comes into effect, consultations with First Nations can proceed, not on whether to end the discrimination. There is no option about that. It must end. But how to transition into an ordered world without discrimination, which provides opportunity and belonging to children from either the paternal or the maternal line of descent.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we will now go to Little Child Law. Dr. Wilton Littlechild, international lawyer. Go ahead, Chief. 5 minutes you have.
Hi, Nigan Gakyo Tatamskad now. I bring you greetings in my language, Mr. Chairman, to all of you. I have a brief note that I wanted to share with you, but first I wanted to thank Great Spirit for blessing us with another day of life. Honorable members, I address you briefly to build on the strength of your work. Before I share a story, allow me to thank you for your ongoing courage to lead our nation during challenging times globally. Last week, the second Global Summit for Indigenous Peacebuilding was held during the 25th session of the UN Permanent Forum. Through you, Mr. Chairman, I thank all the delegations from Canada, including some of you here today, for your ongoing contributions to advance reconciliation, peace, and justice. Of particular importance was the discussions on S2, which, with your permission, Mr. Chairman, I'll share with you. But first, let me go back to the work here since the introduction of Bill S2. Our two delegations who presented before you would like to reaffirm our interventions then and restate our call for a treaty lens through which we must consider ways forward. Today, I'd like to propose we consider three solutions together or one solution with three elements to it. The three elements are similar to the braid of sweetgrass with the three strands. One strand, of course, is the UN Declaration with the American Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action. And thirdly, the treaty, in our case, Treaty number 6. When we look at those three, I want to tell you the story how a Cree Nation took an approach that started in 1981 and 82. After ceremonies for permission, they decided to put into writing a constitution, a treaty-based constitution. On this foundation is a treaty-based government and treaty-based laws. One of those laws is a citizens' law or a membership law. Implementing the TRC call to action number 43 as a treaty-based government, they incorporated the Declaration's articles on treaty enforcement into their constitution. As it is settled law that treaty rights are human rights, They also follow a declaration that Cree is the official language in their territory. They're currently reviewing their citizens' law, taking into consideration what courts have decided recently, and to ensure that they respect all 4 elements of treaty and in compliance with at least 7 articles of the UN Declaration, together with the enhancements by the American Declaration. Within this legal framework are the same considerations of S2, which were the subject of discussions last week at the United Nations. Coincidentally, a 40-year report was tabled last week at the UN. And wouldn't you know it, there's a section on S2. If I may just quote a couple of sentences from it, Mr. Chairman. The path forward for S2 appears to be uncertain. As a result, Bill S2 will likely face debate and proposed amendments in the House of Commons, further delaying justice for First Nations women and their descendants. There's also a resolution that was adopted by delegations in New York that resulted in a letter that's been submitted to the Prime Minister on Bill S2. And of course, it's calling for immediate adoption of the Senate bill. Within this legal framework, we would like to submit a copy for your consideration, the letter of a lot of signatures to support adopting Bill S2 immediately. With that, I look forward to your questions, Mr. Chairman.
Chief, and please submit that letter to the to our clerk so that we can circulate it. Okay, and next we have Ontario Native Women's Association, Ingrid Green, Director of Research and Evaluation. You will have 5 minutes.
Miigwech. Greetings, honorable members of Parliament. I am Ingrid Green, the Director of Research and Evaluation at the Ontario Native Women's Association. Founded in 1971, ONWA is the oldest and largest Indigenous women's organization in Canada. We have over 50 years of experience listening to and supporting and advocating for Indigenous women, including First Nations women and their descendants. The issue of sex discrimination in the Indian Act was one of the catalysts for the formation of the Indigenous women's movement in Canada, including establishing ONWA as an agency. I am here today urgently calling for your support of the Senate's committee's amendments to Bill S2 without further delay. It is ONWA's position that First Nations women have the right to our Indigenous identities, culture, community, and nations, as well as the right to pass on our identity and culture to our children. While Bill S2 is the start, the amendments are needed to fully remedy all the remaining and residual discrimination stemming from previous versions of the Indian Act. Without these amendments, we risk further perpetuating the profound and lasting harm to First Nations. I want to speak about this harm and in particular, the ongoing impacts of the sex discrimination on First Nations women and their families. Loss of status and band membership from marrying out has over time been linked with the appalling high rates of gendered colonial violence that Indigenous women continue to experience, including human trafficking and the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls crisis. First Nations women spoke to this in the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in the 1990s. The National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls also linked sex discrimination in the Indian Act with these high rates of violence against us. The consequences of the legislated discrimination are deadly. The violence against us has been rising at an exponential rate since the National Inquiry was launched in 2016. In fact, it has doubled. In addition to the gendered colonial violence we face, many First Nations women experience trauma, poor health, addictions, poverty, and homelessness that lead to further intergenerational harm through colonial systems. These challenges are then greatly compounded by the lack of access to community and cultural supports. Since 1985, Canada's approach to fixing the two-tiered and convoluted status provisions have displaced First Nations women and their children from their families, communities, and nations, and denied them the right to equal enjoyment of their identities, cultures, languages, and lands. Previous attempted remedies have not been able to fully repair what was lost. The establishment of levels of status resulted in social divisions and too often lateral violence. First Nations women under Section 6.2 bear the brunt of this colonial violence. The divisions and lateral violence within First Nations communities is aggravated by ongoing underfunding from the federal government, which positions new registrants as a threat to First Nations already grappling with a scarcity of resources. Committee members, the rights of First Nations women should not be pitted against the collective rights of our communities. It is time to not only listen to First Nations women, but to act on our recommendations. With respect to the path forward, we implore this committee to fully and with urgency end the sex discrimination in the Indian Act and endorse the amendments to Bill S2. This includes amendments to remove the second generation cutoff by returning to a one-parent rule for transmission of status. Failure to eliminate the second generation cutoff will allow numbers of registered Indians to decline, eventually leading to the extinction of status Indians and entire communities, as you have heard from several witnesses already. A one-parent rule not only tackles the urgent issue of extinction, but also tackles sex discrimination. This rule effectively legislates who First Nation peoples can fall in love with. They should not have to choose their partners based on the ability to pass their rights to their children. I want to close by saying that amending the legislation is just one step. First Nations must also be financially supported to welcome those who have been displaced from their community through forced assimilation. This is central to meeting Canada's fiduciary duties. Honourable members, ONWA calls on each of you to support the amendments to Bill S2 as endorsed by the Senate and by the United Nations Human Rights Committee just last month in their review of Canada's compliance with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. This is an opportunity for a unified act of reconciliation. Our survival as First Nations in Canada and our very lives, safety, and well-being as First Nations women depend on it. Miigwech, thank you for your time.
Miigwech. Okay, so let's go to the question and answers. And first off, for the Conservatives, for 6 minutes, we have MP Morin, please.
Thank you, Chair. This question has been around for about discrimination, and you know we've heard that some legal precedents in terms of not discriminating while you uphold that discrimination. But I want to go to Ms. Sheila Day, and she was mentioning a comment by the Prime Minister. I want to allow her to finish her comment, which may have been stopped a little bit early. Can you finish your last comment? That was made, you were quoting the Prime Minister.
You're on mute.
I was quoting, so I'll just finish and thank you for the invitation to do so. Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau famously said in 1967 that the state has no place in the bedrooms of the nation. But the state has been in the bedrooms of the First Nations since 1876, and it is still there, deciding who can be an Indian. Another Prime Minister, Mark Carney, said 2 months ago when he celebrated the stars of heated rivalry that a core Canadian value is the freedom for individuals to embrace their identity and love whom they choose. Unfortunately, that value seems to apply to gay men, but not to First Nations. Canada is robbing young Indigenous women and men of their identities and forcing them to choose partners based on Indian status, not love. In 2026, all of the victims of the second generation cutoff and the 1985 cutoff are being told to wait. They can't wait longer. They should not be asked to wait longer, and they should not be put in the terrible position that they are now. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Day. And you were talking about waiting and time, and I want to go to, forgive me if I get the name wrong, Grand Chief, how do you say it, Alaltini? How do you say that?
Alatini.
Alatini.
Alatini, thank you.
Yes.
You know, we've heard that, you know, basically, you know, we had our previous witness saying she was doing court action in the 60s and the 70s, and we've had subsequent court action since 1985, step by step. And that, you know, we've heard from several witnesses that it seems like the government's using consultation as a shield. You know, when my colleagues from the government say that we need to get this right, I think the testimony that we've heard from across the country is that we've told you what the answer was since 1985 and even prior. And even in their own latest documents, they say they're going out on this consultation phase. But their latest document also says in November of 2023, the Minister of Indigenous Services Canada launched a collaborative process on the second generation cutoff, Section 10 voting thresholds, as well as the Indigenous advisory process. 2023, they actually started these consultation processes. And the last thing on their latest document says fall of 2026 or the winter of 2027, the memorandum to cabinet with proposed solutions will be introduced. And so do you have any faith that they'll actually, are they using consultation as a shield? And do you actually have any faith that they'll deal with the second generation cutoff in this current parliament by those statements?
My hope is that the House, this committee, will recommend accepting the bill as it has been amended by the Senate. I honestly think that the Senate really listened to the testimony that was received and did what was required. This is extremely impactful in all of our communities, and I think consultation is a shield for what we're seeing right now. I encourage the committee members to end the second generation cutoff. We've heard it. This is, you've got so many experts telling you this is the right step. And delaying is discrimination.
Thank you, Chief. I'm going to go to Chief Littlechild. Chief, you're a champion of sports. We've heard a few testimonies today, right down to families themselves where kids have been excluded from sport. We've seen sport build bridges between First Nations, Indigenous communities, and non-Indigenous communities. Have you witnessed how second generation cutoff has torn people apart, even in sport, when it comes to the youth or even people, our Indigenous people in general?
Yes, thank you for that important observation. But let me begin by thanking you, all of you. Apparently yesterday I was notified that the sports allocation in the budget speech or the economic statement was enhanced quite substantially, because for a lot of years we've been saying that the more investment in sport reduces healthcare costs. There's a ratio of $1 for sports equals $26 of healthcare costs. So that balance hopefully will be sorting itself out in the future. But to go to your question, it's a real serious issue currently. And as a new incoming chair for Hockey Canada on Indigenous participation, I'm hearing stories. Last week and the weekend before, we had our provincial championships in Alberta, both native championships and treaty championships. And there were stories there about exclusion, like you heard this morning. But there's more stories about negative impacts that are racial. There's one arena, for example, I'm told that adults form this line in football. I forgot what it's called. You have a line and everybody tackles you or hits you or bumps you.
We have 30 seconds left, Chief.
The adults are doing that to young children in hockey arenas. And it's really overflowing into racial discrimination and actually hatred in some cases. But sport has the power to advance reconciliation. And
thank you very much.
I'll stop there because I'll wait for others.
And next, there'll be more opportunities for more questions and answers. But Jaime, you're next for 6 minutes.
Yes, thank you. My first question is to Mary Eberts. Mary, I believe that the second generation cutoff is discriminatory. I think it's discriminatory towards in its restrictiveness towards First Nations passing on their descent. But it's been mentioned that it also is discriminatory towards women. And I haven't seen a gender analysis or a court case recently that looks at Section 6.1 and 6.2 that says that that is actually discriminatory either for gender or for race purposes. As someone who used to research this, published on it, and was the Mi'kmaq citizenship coordinator for many years, has there been a recent precedent that has stated that this specific portion of the Indian Act is discriminatory in gender or race? You're on mute, I think.
I think we have to look at the cases that have already taken place, and that is the McIver case and the Deschanel case. There certainly are a lot of statements in there about the gender and sex discrimination of the second generation cutoff. I do take your point. I do take your point that there has not yet been a case analyzing the sex discrimination in the requirement of two parents, but I have analyzed that myself, and it is serious. Some people have spoken about that this morning. It is very easy to tell who is a mother. It is not as easy to tell who has donated sperm to the creation of a child. And the other thing about this is that women face not knowing the father of the child in situations of rape or of gang rape, and they also face intimidation in situations of incest for not being able to put a known father on the certificate. The two-parent rule is absolutely ripe for Section 15 successful challenge.
Can you, I know that if you could at some time put on a gender analysis and send me an email, that would be great, because I'd love to read that analysis. We don't have time for that. And I really wanted to get to Wilton. We spoke at the United Nations about this, and I'm happy to have you here. Is status and membership only something that's being discussed in Canada? How do our neighbors to the south in America determine handle this this status and membership question?
Well, sorry. They, of course, approach it quite differently in the sense that they have a blood quantum rule that they use. So the blood quantum approach is starting to spill into our area through the customs, through the border issues. Our people are now being asked to show their blood quantum before they're allowed into the United States. So the U.S. approach is very different in that way. We don't use that approach here. So the interesting discussion that's currently being held that we've gone through already is their boarding school experience and the impact of boarding schools on the Indian tribes in the United States, because that too, there's a similar path as we've experienced in Canada. They both are culminating to the same question: how do we go forward in a good way? And although they use that blood quantum approach and we don't, I think there's still good news in a sense that there's a solution for a way forward. But that solution has to include a treaty lens. That's our main concern, because a treaty membership is being impacted as well. There's some estimations that there will be no longer any treaty Indians pretty soon, thus no treaties. So the American approach may be necessary as well.
Thank you, Wilton. And I know we had conversations about this, and I know I only have about a minute left, but I wanted to ensure we've had conversations about this committee's continued involvement with the United Nations Permanent Forum. And there's been some discussions, Mr. Chair, and I think it's okay for me to read into the record what we had agreed to in December when we tabled a notice of motion that the committee undertake a review of key findings, recommendations, and themes originating from the Permanent Forum session report of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and that the committee allocate at least one meeting to this topic each calendar year following the table of the official report on 5th. And so I think there's consent, unanimous consent to get that done. And I just wanted to make it official because I know that we might be the first country that actually makes time as a parliament to overview of what the UN Permanent Forum had talked about that year, and I think that's kind of historic. And I want to thank you for your advocacy on this and making sure that this is a reality. Thank you.
Thank you, Jaime. And I saw nodding heads, and I'm just looking, and so that's been read into the record and duly noted. So thank you very much, and it carries. So thank you very much. Now we got to go to online to MP Gill, please, for 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks again to the witnesses who have joined us today. Of course, I'm delighted that we can carry out a study, for example, of the UN reports. It's necessary, but it would be also good if concrete measures were taken. And we're talking about S2 today, and some witnesses have talked about the question of consultation. In my opinion, and hearing from witnesses, I think we're ready to go ahead with a vote on Bill S2, and including the amendments, which I think have all witnesses have said are important. I can't speak on behalf of those who haven't provided testimony yet. But that's what I've heard from witnesses so far. I'd just like to hear a few. I have 5 minutes. There are 5 of you. Perhaps each one of you can take a minute. What would you like to say more? And do you feel, and Madame Alatini said specifically that she would like to move to a vote and to adopt S2, but are all of you, do all of you want to adopt Bill S2 without delay to put an end to this genocide? Perhaps Madam Eberts would like to take the floor. She's the one I see on the screen in front of me.
I'll try and keep time for you.
I said at the conclusion of my introductory remarks that the fact that the Parliament passes S2 will not preclude consultation. Consultation is very important, but my view is that it should be consultation about how to move on from here rather than looking at what can we possibly do about past discrimination. Moving on from here involves questions like, do First Nations have enough resources? What are we going to do about the damage that has already been done? Do we need legislation to repair the situation of families, for example, where the children are all in different situations and some may not have status? And so the consultation is extremely important. It is acknowledged as such in the UNDRIP, but so is the abolition of assimilation and repairs for assimilation. And so the consultation can very nicely be about the repairs for the past assimilation and measures that have been included in Section 6 in 1985. And so I'm not saying no to consultation. I am just saying pass the act first and then consult on how best to create a better world for those who have been harmed by what Justice McIntyre called the evil of discrimination.
2 minutes left to any takers. Okay, so we have Sheila with her hand up. Go ahead.
I agree with what Mary Eberts has just said, and I'd like to add to that over this long period when we've been trying to deal with sex discrimination in the Indian Act, consultation has never led to a change to the discriminatory provisions of the Indian Act. Those changes have only come about through litigation and through Senate amendments to litigation that was introduced for a narrow reason. So I think we need to look at what the history of consultation is with respect to getting rid of discriminatory provisions in the Indian Act. There is no record that it works. So I agree with Mary. We need to pass this legislation as quickly as possible and pivot to the future and how we're going to repair the harms that have been done.
And thank you very much. 1 more minute left. Do we have some hands up? Okay, I see. Go ahead. Take us through.
Thank you. Just to add to that, I absolutely agree that passing the bill as it appears right now is the right thing to do. I absolutely agree on consult on the remedies to the discriminatory impacts of the Indian Act, and I'll take it a step further with regards to modern treaty holders, where there needs to be discussion about the reconciliation between modern treaty citizenship lists or membership lists versus Indian Act banned lists, and the reconciling of programs and services that modern treaty holders deliver to their communities through those registry lists.
And now we move to, next on the list, we have Eric for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to once again thank all of those who have joined us to talk about this important discussion. And I think when we're looking at all that we've discussed here today and through other meetings, there's sort of different layers of conversation, or if I could phrase it that way. There's the discussion of the second generation cutoff itself as a whole. There's a discussion of this legislation, a discussion of the amendments, and I think we've heard loud and clear from witnesses today and at other meetings about your desire to see this pass with the amendments that have been made in the Senate. And I just want to come to Chief Littlechild, if I could start with you first and lean on your expertise to speak to what would be the substantive effect if those amendments were to be removed in a hypothetical situation, just for those of us around this table to understand what that effect would be, and for Canadians and those who might be watching.
I think one of the interesting positive outcomes would be to look at the lead from the Supreme Court of Canada, if I may use that example, in their decision on the Bill C-92 case from Quebec. They looked at the approach that I was kind of advocating, where you look at the elements, the 3 elements, the UN Declaration, treaty, TRC calls to action as a cluster, and maybe take that cluster and create new space, new legal space for a path forward where we could have the example that I gave you of a treaty-based government doing as a solution to the challenge we have collectively on discrimination and racism and so on, by relying on traditional laws and incorporating that into their own constitution and merging it with Canadian law. So I think we need to recognize there's possible ways forward. Sometimes we have to create new legal space of recognition, because the example I'm using is that it works. It's working for that nation through their constitution, through their own law, incorporating traditional practices to create a way forward for their own nation that deals with the discriminatory challenges we're talking about through S2.
Okay. Thank you very much. And I'll go maybe on back online now. I share the frustration that many have expressed in terms of how this government is very good at making promises and announcements and saying a lot of the right things, but then we don't often see that follow through. I mean, I think of the promise to end all boil water advisories on reserve. I think it was by 2019 when that promise was first made. Obviously, that hasn't happened. I think about the then Minister of Public Safety who promised that legislation to make recognize Indigenous policing services as essential would be right around the corner. That was in 2022, 2023. He's really taken a long time driving around that corner. Housing, child welfare, I mean, the list goes on. I know that all in this meeting know this very well. And we also see a similar situation here and the government dragging its feet. So maybe I'll go to Sheila Day if I can, just because you're on the screen in front of me and I see you there. But if anyone else wants to jump in, time permitting, please do so. Can you just further speak to that frustration with how slow the process has been and the impacts it has on people that have been waiting?
Thank you for the question.
Just over 30 seconds, please.
I'll speak very quickly. I work with the Indian Act Sex Discrimination Working Group. As many of you know, that's a coalition of the lead plaintiffs in the litigation and UN petitions that have been brought to deal with the sex discrimination, and the largest First Nations women's organizations in Canada, and the Union of BC Indian Chiefs and Justice for Girls. So it's a broad coalition of groups and individuals who have. It also includes the leading legal experts on this matter. The frustration in that coalition of expert groups and individuals is profound. They've been dealing with this since Jeanette Laval, whom you heard this morning, in 1971. It's 50 years of bit by bit dealing with sex discrimination that transforms itself, takes a different shape, gets added to at the same time as bits are subtracted. So the frustration that you hear from Jeanette and Dawn and Mary Hanneberg and Ingrid Green is profound, and I do hope the committee members will listen to it. This can't keep going on.
Thank you very much. And for the final question, Dr. Hanley.
Thanks everyone for being here and for participating. Grand Chief Valentini, I don't think anyone's given you a shout out as yet for how early you had to be in the morning to be present at committee. I'm not sure if you were able to witness the first hour, but it's certainly forgivable if you were not. As always, you've been very clear in your message, and amongst your opening words were the promise and the burden of Canada's law. And I wonder, I know we've previously had discussions around that, the kind of the interface or the overlap between membership, citizenship, and status and non-status, and you referred to that a little bit in your 1 minute and in the previous testimony. But I just wonder if you could elaborate on that using Kluane First Nation as an example, because there are examples, for instance, of people who become citizens but are non-status, as you've described. There are also people who may be status but are either not eligible or choose not to become members, but they are they do have an allegiance or a hereditary relationship with Kalani First Nation. So there are definitely some nuances and overlaps. So I wonder if you could just describe that for a minute or two to help us understand that difference.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Hanley, for your representation of Yukoners in Ottawa and for that question. I want to highlight the fact that Yukon First Nations there's 11 modern treaty holders, so we get to create our own citizenship code, and most of those nations have something that is defined in the citizenship code that looks at your ties, your familial ties to a nation. So in our Kalani First Nation perspective, it's you have to tie your ancestry back matrilineally to Kalani First Nation from 1949 and prior. So we get to determine who our members, who become citizens of Kalani First Nation, and we provide services to all those citizens. There is some weird anomalies where we have individuals who are status Indians. Maybe they were 60s scoop, they were adopted out. They do not want to be citizens of Kalani First Nation, but they have applied to have their status under Kalani as Indian Act status members. Those two don't reconcile, and so that's one issue. The larger issue that we see in implementing our modern treaties is the fact that we've established our citizenship list. That does not get recognized by Canada at the negotiation table when it comes to negotiating our fiscal transfer arrangements, financial transfer arrangements with Canada for programs and services, for core dollars. There's complex equations that are applied to that. And what is used is our status numbers. And as Sheila mentioned, those numbers are decreasing because of the diminishing ability to have individuals registered as status Indians. So it directly affects our modern treaty holders in Canada because of the inability to register our citizens as status members, even though there's an example I was going to give about my grandpa and my grandmother who they have very different lines when it comes to status citizenship. And I think I'll leave it there. There is definitely an impact to modern treaty holders in the territory.
Thank you very much, and that brings us to the conclusion. And if anybody has anything they want to share in writing, you can send it in to our clerk, and that will be given to the analysts and be included in the entire testimonial process. So thank you very much. Chimigwich to everyone, and truly appreciated all your testimony, and have a great day. All right, I'm going to, there we go. We're done.